Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Very excited for today's presentation. This will be a slightly different format, so we're going to have a longer presentation and then a little bit of Q&A, and then we will come back in a few weeks and have kind of a full Lean Coffee discussion around DX Core 4. And most importantly, just thank you all for being here. So if you're listening or you're speaking, either way, you're participating in this community conversation, and we're so thankful that you're here. With that, I'll pass it over to Nathan.
All right, thanks so much, Amanda. And hi, everyone. My name is Nathan Harvey. I lead up DORA here within Google Cloud. And as is customary, I'm going to just kick us off with a little bit of some of the newer things that are happening with DORA. And Amanda, it doesn't look like I can advance the slides. Would you mind just bumping it ahead for me? Thank you. So if you haven't already, please do download and read the latest DORA report. It's at DORA report, dora.dev/DORA report 24 or 2024. I don't know. It's at the URL that's on the screen, or like use the QR code. That'll get you there. Don't listen to what I'm saying. But if you haven't had a chance, there's a lot here in this report. It's about 120 pages long. So even if you have had a chance, maybe you skipped a chapter or two, go back and read those. And let's go on to the next slide, please. But this year in 2025, one of the things that DORA has done is kind of take our own advice. One of the findings that DORA has always had is that shipping software in smaller batches is a way to improve your software delivery performance. We're taking that same approach this year with our research. We're shipping it in smaller batches. So you don't need to wait until September to get the next DORA report. We've been releasing additional research on AI in particular, and you can grab that at dora.dev/research/AI, and just stay up to date with all of the latest research and findings that we have coming out throughout the year there. And then coming up next is Next. Google Cloud Next is happening April 9th through 11th in beautiful Las Vegas. Hopefully many of you will have an opportunity to join us there. There's a lot of really fun activities that we have. Of course, it will be all things Google Cloud, and there will be a ton of focus on all of the AI offerings that Google Cloud has. And DORA will be there with a number of different things. So you can go to the next slide for me, Amanda. Right. So at a minimum, we've got a couple of meetups that anyone from the DORA community might be interested in. We have a DORA Community meetup happening. So anyone that's at Next and part of this community will have an opportunity to get together in person. That's scheduled for an hour, but then, we can always go somewhere else and continue our conversations. The hour that we'll spend in that meetup, we're just going to do Lean Coffee. So there might be some new folks. We'll have to describe Lean Coffee to them, but we're going to do physical Lean Coffee with Post-its, talk about all of the things that are most important for you at that moment. We also have a platform engineering meetup that's hosted by James Brookbank, who's one of our co-authors on the report and part of the DORA community, of course. Now, what I'd love to do is introduce a good friend of mine, Justin Reock, who works at DX. He is their, I think he's a field CTO. Is that the right title, Justin? I forgot your title.
Deputy CTO. Deputy CTO.
Deputy CTO. I'm sorry if that was a demotion calling you a field CTO. Either way, CTO. I've been a field CTO. Deputy CTO at DX. Now, you might know DX. They're at getdx.com, which I'm sure Justin is going to tell you. But DX is very much friends and part of the DORA community. We are all looking at this idea of how do we help teams, get better at getting better? What sort of measurements can we put in place? And why does developer experience matter so much when it comes to organizational performance, software delivery performance, and so on? So as Amanda mentioned, Justin is here today to give us a presentation and introduction to something that they've been working on over at DX called the DX Core 4. Today will mostly be presentation, although Justin's going to save some time at the end for Q&A. And then on May 1st, Justin will come back and we'll have a session that is largely Lean Coffee. So all of the things that we want to discuss further coming out of Justin's presentation, we'll have an opportunity to do that. Now, just because we aren't having Lean Coffee today doesn't mean no chatting can happen in the chat. You can certainly share insights, perspectives, questions in the chat. We can load those up for Justin towards the end, and we'll definitely run out of time for questions, especially if I keep talking. So, we've got time to come back on May 1st. All right, with that, I want to thank everyone for coming and joining us today. It's good to see so many faces, so many good friends, so many new friends, so many members of the DORA community. Justin, I'll hand things over to you.
Thanks so much, Nathan. Let me get sharing here. Okay. So today we're going to talk about how we build 10x development organizations using modern developer experience metrics and frameworks. This talk has actually evolved since I was field CTO. That's probably where that came from at Gradle several years ago, working on developer productivity engineering initiatives. And if you're not familiar with DPE, you should look at what Gradle's doing with there too. It's a very scientific approach to improving developer experience. So this is actually several iterations later of that talk. So if you happen to have seen any of that, you might see some of this material is a little bit familiar, but I try to establish sort of a foundation as to kind of how we got where we are today in terms of our developer experience metrics and frameworks. If you would like to follow along, all the slides and resources that I'm going to mention in this talk are already available for you at this page here. So you'll see the slides, probably later when we've got this recording available, we'll link to it. And then there's a number of resources that I'm going to mention in this talk, such as survey templates and things, which are free and available to you to start using if any of these techniques really resonate and you want to get started with them today. So feel free to check that out. I will flash this up again at the end of the talk as well in case you miss it. Nathan, thank you so much for that intro. And I have been involved in the DORA community now for a little while as well. I love what this group does. I love the lean coffee sessions. I'm really, really looking forward to that. We ran a similar summit called the Bridges Summit, which we're going to be running again this year with also sort of a lean coffee feel to it. I just think that they're wonderful. I think it was almost a 7-hour online session. And I think we started that session with about 120 people, and I think we still had over 100 people 7 hours later in an online session. So just how engaging this format can really be. So Nathan mentioned I'm the deputy CTO of DX. Previous to this, I worked for a company called Cortex. I was their head of developer relations. They ship an internal developer portal. And then, as I mentioned before that, working for Gradle. So I've been kind of like neck deep in the developer experience and productivity world now for a number of years. I find it to be really, really fascinating and impactful. And so again, very thankful for this community and the focus that you have on that work. Okay, let's talk about the myth of the 10x engineer. Okay, that developer that is somehow able to crank out 10 times as much code or work as their peers in the organization. And I really do think of the individual 10x engineer the same way that I think of Sasquatches or magical unicorns or the chupacabra. And no offense if you believe in any of those things, but I think they are well established as myth. And I do believe, and there's data to back this up, that within a single organization, 10x engineers are a myth. But every myth has an origin story. And I think that the 10x developer came from this study, which is an excellent study that turned into a great book. Now, the Peopleware book follows a study called the Coding War Games, where almost 100 companies and over 600 developers were asked to complete basically a business task and keep track of how long it took for them to complete that task. Now you had multiple engineers, developers within the same organization working individually on this. So they were even competing against one another within the same organization. They used their own workspace. They used whatever language was familiar to them. There was no prescription as to what language they should use. Really just work the way that you normally work and keep track of how long it takes to complete this task. And some very interesting information and data came out of this study. First of all, within the same organization, as you see on the left here, there was only about a 21% difference in productivity between engineers that were working in that same organization. And now if you compare that to what you see on the right here, that there was an 11.1x difference in productivity between the highest and the lowest performing organizations. In other words, you had some organizations in this study that were doing more than 10 times better than the lowest performing organizations. That 21% becomes basically statistically insignificant across the entire spread. But it did teach us something very important, and that is that 10x developers within the organization may be a myth, but 10x organizations are very real, okay? And if you've studied the way that we look at developer experience metrics and productivity metrics, you'll probably come across sort of the technique that you really shouldn't measure productivity at the individual output level. You should really measure it sort of at the team output level. And that kind of goes along with what this data is showing us, right? It's the collective organization that we can really put sort of a productivity multiplier on. So, there's a lot in this in the book Peopleware, and I do recommend you check it out. I still think it's one of the best books about developer experience out there, even though the last edition was 2013, but still some very, very relevant data in there, because it's mostly experiential stuff in terms of the factors that move the needle, and we'll look at that in a minute. But really, the outcome was that the best performers are clustering in some organizations, while the worst performers are clustering in others, and some companies are doing a lot worse than others. There's something about their environment, their corporate culture, that's either failing to attract and keep good people, or maybe even worse, making it impossible for good people to work effectively. Okay, so stuff that didn't move the needle in this study were kind of surprising. Things like the programming language used, with the exception of assembly. Our assembly developers, they were a little slower, but higher generation languages performed basically the same. Years of experience, people within about 2 to 10 years of experience performed between 2 to 10 years of experience. They performed roughly at the same level. There wasn't much of a difference there. Salary, like top performers at the time that this study was done were only making about 10% more than the lowest performers in this study. So an interesting bit of data there too. But what did matter? Okay, so if you look at this chart, this comes right out of the book and out of the study. On the left, you see the top performing businesses and the way that they answered questions like, how much dedicated workspace do you have, right? Almost twice as much given to the top performing companies. Is it acceptably quiet? Is it acceptably private? 3 times as many people reported it was acceptably private in the top performing organizations. Can you silence your phone? Back then, we had these big chunky conference phones, and you could divert them or you could silence them. And I think most importantly, do people often interrupt you needlessly, right? 38% said yes in the highest performing companies, whereas twice as many in the lowest performing companies said that. So I think what this data is telling us, the phrase hadn't even been coined yet, but increased productivity ultimately came down to a better developer experience, right? And those of us who have been kind of close to this space, this is starting to become sort of common sense, right? When we talk about developer experience, we're not talking about free beer for developers, although I'm sure everybody really appreciates that. What we're really talking about is removing sources of friction, removing unnecessary toil, making it possible for developers to be as productive as they can be and work at the level of their talent. And if you look at some of these questions, right, now we would think about these things in terms of encouraging flow state, minimizing context switching for developers, right? So really getting into sort of the granular details of what makes a good developer experience. And we're going to talk a lot about that throughout this whole talk. So it didn't come from nowhere, right? And despite sort of understanding this, it really wasn't until we started moving into this, like what we're all calling platform engineering. We called it platform ops for a little while after DevOps. But it wasn't really until we got to this point that we started putting a real focus on developer experience. I think DevOps has solved major challenges for the industry. I come from a time when I was developing software full-time where you would compile an artifact and copy it to a disk and like maybe walk it to another building and hand it to a QA team, and they would load it up on some server that has zero parity with the environment that you had developed it in the first place, and it could take weeks and months to get software out. So none of this is an indictment of DevOps, right? DevOps solved major challenges for us, but it is a fair criticism that many people have observed that there wasn't quite enough dev in DevOps. But now we've kind of moved to this platform engineering, which includes DevOps, right? And we're gonna break that down in just a moment. So sort of despite knowing this, it really hasn't been until the last few years that we've started really making a better developer experience part of our goals and part of what engineering leadership is sort of rated on. So these origins and insights around DevOps and around metrics and frameworks, we can look to the ancient business wisdom of the 70s and 80s, and I see John Willis is on this call. We can look even further back to the work of Deming and Toyota and Lean to find a lot of the foundation for where these frameworks make sense today. Now, the goal is, in my opinion, one of the best, most important business books ever written. And if you haven't read it before, I do recommend it. It's not a business textbook. It's a dramatic, page-turning fiction that has a protagonist and it has a full story, and it's a very entertaining read, but it introduces something called the theory of constraints. And if that sounds familiar, but you haven't read The Goal, you may have read The Phoenix Project. I'm sure almost everybody on this call is at least familiar with this book. And, you know, if you talk to the authors of The Phoenix Project, or if you look at the blurb at the beginning of the book, you will see that this book is a direct homage to The Goal, right? This is effectively teaching theory of constraints through the eyes of a VP software engineer, VP software manager, as opposed to a manufacturing leader, which was the case in The Goal. But the outcomes and the lessons are still the same, and it focuses again on the theory of constraints. Now, there are a lot of takeaways to the theory of constraints, and I don't want to trivialize it, but one of the most important takeaways is that culturally, we have this tendency in business to think about cost as the most important component of how we run a business. Now, the theory of constraints, Ellie Goldratt was a physicist, right, turned business strategist, right? And he kind of had this intellectual leap that there are physics that govern complex machinery, and a business is a complex machine. So he breaks down that machinery into these three subcomponents of cost, throughput, and inventory. And the theory of constraints tells us that although we have a tendency to really focus on cost when we think about the health of an organization or a health of the business, what we really need to focus is on that machine doing the job it was supposed to do. All right. So take a lawnmower, for instance, as a complex machine. That lawnmower to cut grass has a cost, right? It needs gas or maybe electricity. And if it's a robot vacuum cleaner, somebody has to push it, or a robot lawnmower, somebody has to push it or whatever. But there's a cost and an energy associated with actually making the machine do its job. Then there is the inventory of that machine, which are all the parts that make up the machine, right? The spinning blades and the housing and everything like that. Finally, that machine has a throughput. It's supposed to cut grass, and hopefully a lot of grass. And what the theory of constraints tells us is if that lawnmower isn't cutting grass, in other words, if its throughput isn't what we expect it to be, well, it's not really a lawnmower, right? It's just sort of a pile of inventory and cost. Now, the same thing is true for a business, right? And if we think about the business of software, we can think about cost as still organizational cost, still cost of fully loaded engineers, the cost of dev tooling, everything that we need to invest to push out a product. Inventory is code, right? And like any inventory, we need to convert that inventory from a work in progress to throughput or money for the business, right? And so this is where you see a lot of DevOps theory really trying to decrease the distance between like developer hands-on keyboard and actually getting a product out to market in small incremental ways that improve the flow of money back into the business, right? We don't want 3-month-long cycles where our inventory, which is our code, are effectively rotting, and we need to worry about new security vulnerabilities and bugs and things like that that'll impact the code. We want to get that code out to market as fast as possible. And so we've adopted, using this complex physics, this factory model for our developer organizations. We now take a lot of what we've learned from the physics of running an efficient factory and applied that to the techniques that we promote in DevOps. And so now we get a picture like this. And we now have never-ending stand-up calls, and we now have agile waterfalls. I don't know how we came up with those, but we have those too. So there's still some stuff to do, but you know, that is not to say that there aren't very, very good ideas to take away here from Deming's work on systems thinking, from variability, and all these other aspects of profound knowledge. In fact, if you look at the same metrics that are typically used in factory and in manufacturing, so many of these metrics overlap with common engineering metrics that we pay attention to, right? So lead time and cycle time, work in progress, inventory and turns, our throughput, right? Our yield. We can find so many of these metrics relatable, but as much similarity as there is between the work that's done on a factory floor and the work that's done in an engineering organization, adding the opinionated knowledge worker to the value stream changes the scope of that value stream. Now, just because these concepts kind of stemmed from DevOps, again, like none of this is to say that none of these hyperboles that like DevOps is dead or bad or any of those things. That the DevOps mindset is so important, and it has to remain part of our thinking as we tune towards a 10x organization by providing better developer experience. We must still maintain what I still think is the mindset for DevOps, which is Eric Pearson's now I would say almost apotheosized quote. It's no longer the big beating the small, but the fast beating the slow, right? This is still very true to this day. And in many ways, the velocity of our organization is going to contribute to the overall success of that organization. But I think it's also important that we've learned now that speed isn't the whole picture, right? There are other aspects of this if we want to create a frictionless environment for our developers where they can be fully productive. But, and I don't need to preach to this community at all, but DORA was definitely the first on the scene to try to measure various aspects of DevOps success. And it gives us a lot of direction as to how to get better. But if you look at these metrics, right, if you look at things like deployment frequency, an amazing distillation of an engineering team's culture, right? I mean, I think that there's no argument that if you look at an organization that can release code 100 times a day, not necessarily needs to, but can, versus the culture of an organization that only has process or automation that can release, once every month or every couple of months. There's really no arguing that engineering organization with a much higher deployment frequency has fixed a lot of other problems, right? So this is telling us a ton about the way that we can deliver software, about the efficiencies of delivering software, about reducing the distance between hands-on keyboard and actually getting code out to market. But it doesn't tell us everything, right? Again, we add the opinionated knowledge worker. If we think about the factory floor again, if a factory worker has opinions about the way that widgets should be assembled and, if their own cognitive fatigue is factoring into that value stream, it's not as impactful as when the full product is really coming out of the head and really the prefrontal cortex of the developer. So obviously DORA was made incredibly popular. It's highly effective, but it is at this point almost a decade old. Right. So we have learned things. The industry has changed, right? We've had other disruptions to the industry that have forced us to start thinking beyond what DORA can do for us, specifically in the realm of developer experience. So DevOps and DORA have still not captured all of the bottlenecks and friction and obstacles to throughput that engineering organizations that can run into. Many are hiding right in plain sight in the developer experience itself. And a 10x organization needs to consider every aspect of the developer value stream, both internal and external. And we have to move away from rating our organizations based on single metrics. I'm sure plenty of folks in this community are familiar with sort of the pitfall of Goodhart's law, which says that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. So we need to not singularly focus on isolated measures. We need to think about a spectrum of metrics that can help us tell a full picture about the health of that organization. And this is where we've started to witness, I would say, the rise of the platform engineer. And I want to stress that platform engineering is not a practice that aims in any way to replace or subsume DevOps. Really, I think it augments it, right? I think we take what we've learned from DevOps and we add in a focus, a dimension of developer experience, and also of product management, right? When we're building these development platforms, we should be thinking about these platforms as a product that we are delivering to customers, whereas the developers are the customers. We should be gathering feedback. We should be rating the health of the platform. We should be not order takers as platform engineers. We should anticipate the needs of our developers based on the data and feedback that we get from that platform, right? So really, I see the platform engineer as embracing all three of these different disciplines of DevOps, developer experience, and product management. And because of that, we need a broader framework And so this is where the SPACE framework became useful a few years ago. And it was, as you can see, it was authored by several people who also were involved in creating DORA. So you had researchers from Microsoft, you had Nicole Forsgren working at GitHub at the time, Margaret Ann Story, Peggy Story, who is chief scientist at DevX and was responsible for authoring a lot of the SPACE framework. And SPACE framework helps us sort of answer this, right? We have this tendency to know, well, what should we be looking at? Should we be looking at system metrics? Can we trust qualitative metrics? Can we trust self-reported data? And so the SPACE framework allows us to capture these metrics in a non-prescriptive way, right? It simply provides dimensions of satisfaction, performance, activity, communication, and efficiency that we can gather data in whatever way we choose, right? We could run a free-form survey. We can start gathering system metrics if we want to be able to look at performance metrics, if we want to be able to look at efficiency metrics. But satisfaction and well-being is, of course, how fulfilled and happy a developer feels about their work, often referred to as developer joy. Performance is really like if we have a process in place, like code reviews. Are those reviews going well, right? Is the process doing what we intended it to do? Activity, this is just raw behavior. This is commits. This is lines of code. This is developers on keyboard cranking things out. Communication and collaboration, how people work together. And then efficiency and flow, right? Are we allowing developers to stay in a healthy flow state with minimal interruptions, as we learned from the coding war games, is essential in creating a 10x organization. Okay, so most organizations are not aligned when it comes to these 5 dimensions. And the study that's still pretty recent, about 3 years ago, April of 2022, between Microsoft and the University of Victoria, they tested SPACE framework across individual contributors or developers and group contributors or their managers. And it was a very simple activity. They just asked developers to write about, when thinking about your work, how do you define productivity? And they asked managers a similar question when thinking about your team. How do you define productivity? And when we look at the results, we can see that there's still a lot of work to do in terms of aligning leadership with the ground truth of the organization. We see on the left ICs, these are developers reporting 50% of what they talked about in their response were activity metrics, right? Commits, lines of code, that sort of thing, right? Whereas managers focused overwhelmingly on performance when we look at this, on how well processes were performing. Barely anybody was talking about satisfaction, which is a real problem as we learn from coding war games, right? So there's still a lot of work to do in terms of educating the industry and aligning members of an organization to kind of get behind SPACE. You really want to balance these dimensions, right? SPACE doesn't call out that any one of these dimensions is any more important than another, right? And so what we want is a nice balanced focus on all 5 of these dimensions. Well, nobody knows more about the friction in the software development lifecycle than the developers themselves. So revolutionary idea here to try to align. What if we just asked developers what they thought about the health of the organization? It's really interesting when we look at designing questions in a way that actually has some rigor behind it, right? When we've done research to say that these are like valid questions, efficacious questions that are able to get data for us that can be very actionable and help drive our decision making. So when we look at, for instance, a quantitative metric of PR cycle time, right? Very common when we want to understand the velocity of an organization. We can also just ask developers how often they work on small iterative changes and ask them never, rarely, sometimes, very often, always, right? When we do this, it's striking how similar the samples become. Like we can look at system metrics, but when we ask the question this way and we get a large enough sample size from our engineers, these answers come out within a similar margin of error, right? Same with commit frequency, right? We can look at that, right? We can look at the metrics come out of GitHub, or we can just ask developers whether they have uninterrupted time for deep work, time to first code review, or I receive code reviews in a timely manner, right? So it's really interesting, like when we start blending, looking at quantitative data and blending that with qualitative data to get sort of a context, we start seeing a much fuller picture, right? We like to use a lot of like sort of medical and health metaphors and stuff at DX. And you know, one of these in terms of sort of understanding context is like you go to the doctor and say, I'm not feeling very well, I don't feel good. Then the doctor grabs all your metrics, your blood pressure, your pulse, all that stuff, and says, well, there's nothing wrong with you. Yeah, but I don't feel well, right? So it's like understanding the context and then actually telling a full story with metrics and vice versa, again, just gives us a much broader view into what's actually happening within the organization. Now, they both have their pros and cons, right? Quantitative metrics are very easy to measure these days, especially if you have like a decent platform engineering effort. It's not hard to gather some of these metrics, and they're objective, right? There's not an emotional component. There's not a bias. It's just the systems saying what the systems are doing. But as I kind of mentioned, they are incomplete. They don't have a full context always. And so on their own, they don't always tell you things that are really actionable that can help you drive decision making. So qualitative metrics then are a little bit more comprehensive, and they tell you sort of why a thing is the way that it is. But they are difficult, right? For anybody who's ever tried to run an engineering or developer survey before, they are deceptively difficult to have success with, right? Coming up with the right questions, getting the right participation rate, reducing fear, or encouraging psychological safety around this survey. Like, is this survey going to somehow reflect on my own performance, right? So you have to be culturally very careful about the way that you approach this. So it can be difficult, and there's just a high cost to execute. But when we're able to do both of them together, we form the best possible picture that we can get of the health of the organization. So this is where the third metric framework that we're going to talk about today came in. And this is the DevX metrics, DevX framework. And you'll see also similar authors here. Now we've got Abi, my boss from DX, working on this. Still Peggy Story, Margaret Ann Story, doing work. So as well as Nicole Forsgren. So this is very much like a continuation of foundational research that we already have, right? Where we're saying, okay, DORA got us to a certain point and tells us wonderful things about software delivery and engineering health. Space allows us to bring in some qualitative metrics and start thinking about satisfaction and collaboration and other elements of culture that are important to drive a 10X organization. And now DevX is really starting to get in the head, in the prefrontal cortex, and I know I keep bringing that up. I'm going to talk about that in a minute when we talk about flow state of developers. We're looking at their ability to stay in flow. How often can they stay in a flow state? We're looking at making sure that not reducing cognitive load. I think that phrase is thrown around a little bit too much. We're really refocusing cognitive load on new problems for the business, right? Solving interesting challenges, not having all this cognitive load be more focused on toil or sort of keeping the lights on for the business. And then efficient feedback loops, right? That's an essential part of the developer experience. I mean, one could argue that the developer experience is really just a series of feedback loops that we try to keep as efficient as possible. Okay, so what happens during flow state, right? And why am I so focused on prefrontal cortex and refocusing cognitive load? There have been recent studies that are really interesting that I recommend you check out. In fact, I'll try to dig some up as a follow-up for our lean coffee session. On what actually causes flow state in the brain. Now, we know that flow state is really healthy for productivity, right? I think when we've all experienced it, not even necessarily writing code, right? Flow state is something that can be induced in anyone who is moderately skilled at a task and enjoys the task and is able to focus on that task without interruption. Free-form jazz musicians, so improvisational jazz musicians, are being studied right now to try to figure out the origins of flow state, because they can go into a flow state almost immediately. And what the neuroscience is teaching us is that when we retrieve skills and long-term storage from the back of our brains, and we shuffle that data to the front of our brains, the prefrontal cortex, and use that to actually control our bodies and do the things that we're trying to do, that constant cycling of knowledge and long-term storage from the back of the brain to the front releases neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine and norepinephrine, all these chemical neurotransmitters that are responsible for inducing a state of flow. right? So the study of this and understanding, like, if we can keep developers in a flow state as often as possible, not only will they be more productive because they're more focused in their work, but they're going to enjoy their work more. Why? Because the opposite of flow state is disarray, a lack of focus, right? An uncalm execution of work. And what's happening in the prefrontal cortex is very interesting too. Every time we ask a developer to context switch onto another task, the brain has a way of sort of creating chapters for the work that you've done throughout the day. And it does that with a chemical signal. It releases glutamate toxin into the prefrontal cortex, which induces a little bit of fatigue, right? So every time we ask a developer to context switch off to something, answer a Slack message, jump into a meeting, move away from the work that has induced flow for them, a little bit more glutamate is released, and more and more and more, until that developer becomes fatigued, right? Really until that person becomes fatigued. Now, the slippery thing about cognitive fatigue is that it's hard sometimes to recognize. I think all of us have been able to do basic tasks and perform basic work while we're feeling cognitively fatigued. That the difference is that it's very hard for us to innovate. It's very difficult for us to elevate the work that we're doing. And so we can draw this sort of indirect relationship between cognitive fatigue and innovative capacity of an organization. And I do believe we can extrapolate that globally. So I think that really by focusing on helping to keep software engineers in a state of flow, we lead to global impact of better quality software and more innovation overall. So how do we measure some of this stuff? Well, with feedback loops, cognitive load and flow state, there are actual perceptions. So satisfaction with things like automated test speed and output, for instance. Cognitive load, the perception of the complexity of the code base, how readable is the code. And then of course there's workflows, system metrics that we can look at here too. Time it actually takes to generate CI results within the developer's inner loop. How quickly are they getting feedback about their work, and how long do they have to wait for a build to complete before they can get back to coding? Okay, so now we have three wonderful metric sets. We've got our DevX metrics on the left. We've got our space framework sort of here in the middle, and we have our DORA metrics on the right. And we have interplay and tensions between all of these metrics. Every single relationship between one of these dimensions or metrics can be a story about the way the engineering team is performing. And this is complex, right? We're starting to run into something called Ashby's Law. If you're not familiar with that one, we talk about Conway, we talk about Goodhart's Law. Ashby's Law, I don't think is talked about enough. It really needs to be a point of discussion in platform engineering. Ashby's Law, effectively, it's the cybernetics researcher, Dr. Ross Ashby, in the 50s, realized that for any system to reliably and comprehensively control another system, it must have what's called requisite variety. In other words, that system must have as many or more variables as the system that it's trying to operate and control. So the net of that is that whatever we try to build over these very complicated platforms and the very sophisticated platforms is going to be as complex or more complex than the platform itself. So it's time to start distilling. It's time to start looking at some of the relationships between these metrics and seeing if we can fold them into a single metric set that's a little bit more portable based on correlations between this data. And that's exactly what the DX Core 4 aims to do, right? It takes some of the most impactful metrics across DORA, Space, and DevX and blends it all into a single metric format across 4 dimensions of speed, effectiveness, quality, and also impact. So we're not going to go through all of these, but there's plenty of information available here. When you look at, for instance, speed, diffs per engineer can actually be a good metric for figuring out how much work is being done by a team, right? And this asterisk is very important. We do not want to measure diffs per engineer at the individual level. We'll run smack into Goodhart's Law. We'll start running into problems with psychological safety. We'll start having a tendency to either weaponize or incentivize this one metric, and then we're really in trouble. So we want to look at things at the team level here, right? The textbook example is, let's say that I've got a team of engineers, and one of those engineers is more senior and spends most of their time mentoring, helping other developers with their code, doing code review, right? Their diffs per engineer metric is not going to look great. But if you take that team member away, the team's output is going to tank, right? Because that team member is incredibly essential, right? So we have to be very careful when we look at output metrics that we're not setting ourselves up for good Hart's law. We want to look at effectiveness through something called the Developer Experience Index, which I'll get to in just a moment. And we want to look at change failure rate, DORA metric for quality, and percentage of time spent on new capabilities for impact. This is really important. What this allows us to do is correlate time savings and reduction of toil and things like that within the organization to whether it means that those developers are able to refocus on solving new challenges or shipping new features, right? Time itself is an abstract resource. You can do whatever you want with it. So it's not enough to merely say that we're saving developers time, right? We also need to make sure that that frees them up to work on more satisfying things, to shift their cognitive load to work that's important to them and that drives their own satisfaction. So now we can do this, right? The DX Core 4 is going to give us a nice blend of qualitative and quantitative metrics that allows us, again, to form this fuller picture. So what is this Developer Experience Index? So it looks at 14 different data points, which we'll look at in a moment. And it uses linear regression and averaging to come up, and normalization, to come up with a 0 to 100 scale of the quality of developer experience. And it really means like, how much friction have we eliminated? How often are developers able to stay in flow? How much toil have we taken out of the system? Are developers able to work effectively? Again, that is really the way that we think about developer experience. So we have refined this thing through reuse, through rigorous research, which is available, and we have like a 40-page white paper on this with eye-watering math. But basically, each 1 point gain in this 0 to 100 scale translates to effectively saving 10 hours annually per developer. And yes, we do have a math proof for this. It is available. It is working out. The data is being validated. We're looking at things like batch size, the ability to stay in a state of deep work, how confident we are in changes that we make to the system, how long does a local iteration take, how maintainable is the code, and then trying to look at this in terms of these outcomes of speed and ease of delivery, quality, engagement, and efficiency. And so this index takes a lot of what we're pulling into Core 4 and what in terms of effectiveness and what we consider to be an organization that is culturally efficient for developers to do their best work in, and distilling it down to this one normalized index. It's a formative measure of how and really to what extent the right conditions exist for developers to be able to deliver effectively. Okay, I think all of us, especially in this community, understand and appreciate that knowing how to measure productivity or even defining productivity has remained very elusive for a lot of us, but I really believe that the Core 4 is right now the best possible way available to do it. So thanks very much. I hope that this was helpful and educational. Again, if you want to see some of the resources, including a link to Peopleware, some survey templates, which I'll get to in just a moment, that can allow you to get started measuring Core 4, you'll find those resources here. This is a direct link to our survey templates. So you can start using these today. There's no prescription as to how you actually roll them out. You're welcome to just copy and paste these questions into Google Forms or something like that. There is some good information in this template from Laura, our CTO, on how to run an effective developer survey. It's like a micro workshop. It's about 5 minutes. It's dense with good tactics on how to make this stuff work within your organization. And with that, I will take us back to questions.
And I see there are a couple of questions in the chat. I would ask, if you've posted a question in the chat before you leave today, copy that question and go post it on the mailing list. And for those of you that still have questions that you haven't had a chance to answer yet either, remember, Justin's coming back on May 1st. We'll have a lean coffee discussion where we can get into those topics and more, but also leverage that mailing list. That's what it's there for. We can have asynchronous conversations there. Keep this conversation going. I think that's really important. With that, I'm going to hand it back to Amanda.
Thank you, Nathan. So We have several events coming up, and I just realized that we don't have the next in 2 weeks. We have a kind of a new thing we're trying where Steve Fetton and I, Steve is a DORA guy, we both have read the Field Guide to Human Error, which was a recommendation from our generative culture session in January. And we're just going to get together and talk about it. So I encourage you to join us. No need if you haven't read the book yet. You could still participate in the conversation or listen in. And if you have read it, would love to hear your thoughts on that. And then we've got Adrian coming in to talk about code reviews. We're going to talk about resilience. Then we're going to follow up again with a lean copy only on today's discussion. And then, as you can see, I won't read these all off, but so many great things coming up, and very excited to keep these discussions going. So thank you all for being here. But as Nathan said, I really do encourage you to take those questions that you had today that you weren't able to get to, put those out to the mailing list, because there are a lot of people within the community that aren't able to join at this time. And we want to make sure that we include them in these discussions as well.